Do forensic psychologists spend their time solving murders? If not, then what do they really do? And what about other fascinating fields of psychology, like positive, evolutionary, sports, developmental, and social? Today, let's answer these questions and a lot more. It's time for our first ever session of speed dating with fields of psychology. Hi, it's Bradley again from the Psi Chi Central Office in Tennessee. And with me via telephone is Dr. Ethan A. McMahan at Western Oregon University. Hi, Ethan. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Bradley. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So do you have any past experience with podcasts?
I've been interviewed for one or two podcasts previously, but, I'm not very famous, so I don't get these calls very often.
Okay. Well, this is my first one, so... So what about speed dating? I've not done that before either. Have you?
No, I have not. I hear it's a hoot and a holler, but it's not an experience I've had before.
Okay. Well, from what I understand about the process, a different field of psychology is going to sit down across from Ethan one by one, and then I'll give him 2 or 3 minutes to answer a few questions. And then once time is up, I'll ring a bell and let you know that we're ready to move on. Yeah. But Ethan, I won't really cut you off with the bell. They told me that every time I interrupt a past board member, they're going to tear off a corner of my paycheck. So I'm not gonna do that.
Yeah, I was going to say if you started cutting me off, I'd be firing off some angry emails there to the central office.
Yeah, I bet. Who wouldn't? So let's get started by bringing on our first field of psychology. So sitting down with Ethan right now is an ever-smiling and ever-positive face among the fields. This field is constantly seeking new ways to uplift us all, and I'm sure Ethan knows a lot about this field too because it's actually his area of expertise. Everyone, please welcome the field of positive psychology. Ethan, this field seems a little shy. Could you please give us a brief background on the history of positive psychology?
So one of the things that you need to keep in mind about just pretty much every area of psychology is that many of the questions addressed by that area have been addressed in some form or fashion for millennia, thousands of years, by famous philosophers, for example. Really, what positive psychology is focused on is the nature of happiness and well-being and how we can cultivate that. And musings about the nature of well-being, happiness, optimal functioning are very old. You can find examples of this in the literature all over the place. However, the field of positive psychology wasn't really initiated in earnest until the late 20th century, when Martin Seligman and his colleagues started to wonder what would happen if we examined what goes right with people rather than what's wrong with them. Essentially, the idea is to study positive functioning rather than psychopathology. Apparently, he started wondering this with his good pal, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, on a beach in Mexico, so you can kind of see what might have inspired him. Seligman made this the theme of his APA presidential address, and then from there, the field really took off to the point where now we have dedicated conferences, dedicated journals, dedicated research laboratories, and so on. So it's a pretty thriving area.
Okay, and what do positive psychologists typically do? Like, what kind of questions do they try to solve?
All right. So another thing you need to keep in mind is that pretty much every area of psychology involves the generation of knowledge through research, for example, and then the application of that knowledge in some domain. In this particular case, as I mentioned very briefly, positive psychologists study optimal feeling and functioning and then apply this in various areas. So, for example, basic positive psychological research could be applied to the work world to improve employee satisfaction and health. So we might take the literature on capitalization and say, well, instead of addressing your employees' weaknesses, why don't you focus on capitalizing their strengths and see if that improves their performance?
Okay. And third and final question. Say a listener of this podcast wanted to go on a date with positive psychology, or say they wanted to pursue a career. Where should she or he start?
Most positive psychologists have graduate degrees, typically either master's degrees or PhDs. So going to grad school is a good start. Well, going to college in general is a good start, but going to grad school is definitely the way to go. Now, what degree you need depends on the nature of the work you want to do. So if you wanted to be an academic like I am, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend because the pay is not nearly as good as what you think it might be, or if you wanted to be a clinical psychologist, you would need a PhD. But if you wanted to apply positive psychological principles to some area, again, the work world, for example, your options are more open. But generally speaking, again, what you want to do, get undergraduate training and then get some graduate training in areas related to positive psych.
Okay, great. Oh, look at that. Perfect timing.
Oh my, I'm amazed at how accurate I was with my answers there.
So positive psychology is now leaving and being replaced by another field. This next field of psychology is ever changing, but it's happening at such a slow rate that it would be really easy to miss it altogether. Please welcome the field of evolutionary psychology. So this field actually offered to speak for herself today, but I thought, who'd have time for that? So Ethan, could you give us a brief history of the field of evolutionary psychology?
Charles Darwin was probably the first evolutionary psychologist, although he never referred to himself as such. Really, the field emerged again in the 1990s, so the late 20th century, when several researchers started examining questions regarding the mind and behavior using an evolutionary approach. Perhaps most notably would be David Buss at the University of Texas, but many others were involved, and really the field has expanded pretty dramatically from there.
Okay, and what do evolutionary psychologists typically do?
Well, the area is actually largely academic, and what evolutionary psychologists do is they apply Darwinian principles like natural selection and reproductive fitness, etc., to questions of the mind and human behavior. So, for example, an evolutionary psychologist might explain the human preference for sugary foods with reference to the fact that, during the majority of our evolutionary history, the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years, importantly, prior to the invention of, say, Krispy Kreme and the gummy worm, an evolutionary psychologist might explain the human preference for sugary foods with reference to the fact that, during the majority of our evolutionary history, the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years, importantly, prior to the invention of, say, Krispy Kreme and the gummy worm, during that period of time, food was much more scarce. So foods that were calorie dense, like sweets, were actually pretty beneficial. And so if you liked these foods, if you had kind of a natural preference for these foods, you were more likely to seek them out, more likely to eat them. And because they were beneficial, you were more likely to survive long enough to reproduce, and so on and so on. And so we're using these evolutionary principles to explain this common human preference that we see this day, and that's an illustration of what an evolutionary psychologist might do.
So what should someone do if they're interested in pursuing a most likely academic evolutionary psychology job?
Yeah, so because this field is largely academic, most folks who are doing this type of work are going to hold PhDs and work at universities and colleges. So the prospective evolutionary psychologist would want to get a relevant undergraduate degree, perhaps in psychology or biology or both, but just a related field, and then attend graduate school studying a particular area of behavior or functioning from an evolutionary perspective. And one of the things to keep in mind about this as well is that there's not a whole lot of evolutionary psych programs that are dedicated to evolutionary psychology. Typically what you find is that a researcher in a given area like social psych or cognitive psych may study some phenomena within that domain but take an evolutionary perspective. And so you'd want to look at what the faculty member or the potential mentor, what their theoretical approach is to confirm that they are taking that evolutionary perspective. But then, go to grad school, get that PhD, and get out there and get studying behavior.
Okay. So, evolutionary psychology had to leave just a few seconds ago, but she wrote down a quick note before she left. So, let's see what that says. Okay, it says, "I wasn't too slow to steal your bell." Well, see, now that's a perfect example of evolutionary psychology changing my behavior to prevent me from getting a pay cut. So, I promise, these jokes just get worse.
Yeah, no, I'm liking them. Keep it going, Bradley.
So our next field of psychology is simply too cool for any of these jokes. I really can't think of anything right now. Ethan, could you please tell me a bit about the history of sport psychology?
Sports psychology, certainly. So the field as we know it today is at least in part the result of what some would say was unhealthy competition between the United States and Russia during the 20th century. Now, the Americans and the Ruskies frequently faced each other in national athletic competitions such as the Olympics. Now, we wanted to beat the Russians wanted to beat us. So each country then invested a lot of resources into things like sports laboratories and paying people to study issues related to sports psychology, things that focus on how to improve athletic performance. But then also there were some other factors that came into play. So, for example, the professionalization of sports. So taking sports from, instead of being primarily for recreation or amateurs and making a profession out of it, that increased the importance of competitiveness and in effect channeled even more resources towards anything that could improve athletic records, such as the application of sports psychology. And so the field really just grew from there over the 20th century and into the 21st century now.
So what exactly do sport psychologists do?
Well, so the primary objective of sports psychology is to understand the many ways in which psychological factors affect athletic performance, and also how athletics impact psychological and physical functioning. So this field also has a healthy applied side as well, focusing on the implementation of various training strategies, interventions that we might use to improve athletic performance and also just improve the well-being of athletes more broadly.
And what should someone do to pursue a career in sports psychology?
Like any of these other areas, need an undergraduate degree. This is typically a degree in psychology, but it's not uncommon for a sports psychologist to have majored in something like physical education or exercise science or kinesiology. As usual for most psych-related careers, a graduate degree is typically required to work as a sports psychologist, but the degree that you need depends on what type of sports psychology you want to get into. So, for example, if you wanted to conduct research or teach sports psychology at a college or university, that is, being an academic sports psychologist, a PhD would typically be required. Another thing to keep in mind is that many sports psychologists are licensed clinical or counseling psychologists who are going to work with athletes. And so in that case, they're going to need a PhD or a PsyD in clinical or counseling psych. However, given that sports psychology has this pretty healthy applied side, many careers require only a master's degree, typically in combination with some type of certification from the American Association for Sports Psychologists. So you've got a lot of options available to you.
You're listening to the Psych Everywhere podcast. For a brief intermission, let me tell you a bit about our guest speaker today, Dr. McMahan. Ethan A. McMahan, Ph.D., is an associate professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Western Oregon University. There, he teaches courses in research methods, advanced research methods, and positive psychology. He is passionate about undergraduate education in psychology and has served Psi Chi members in several ways over the last years, including as a faculty advisor, Psi Chi Western Region Steering Committee member, Grants Chair, and most recently as the Western Regional Vice President of Psi Chi. His research interests focus on hedonic and eudaimonic approaches to well-being, folk conceptions of happiness, and the relationship between nature and human well-being. His recent work examines how exposure to immersive simulations of natural environments impact concurrent emotional state, and more broadly, how regular contact with natural environments may be one route by which individuals achieve optimal feeling and functioning. Dr. McMahan is a regular columnist for the Contemporary Fields in Psychology series in Ion Psychi magazine. He is published in the Journal of Positive Psychology, the Journal of Happiness Studies, Personality and Individual Differences, and Eco-Psychology, among other publications. He completed his undergraduate training at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs and holds a PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Wyoming. Okay, another field of psychology is sitting down with us now, so let's get back to the interview. Seated across from Ethan right now is the cutest field of psychology that you've ever seen. Right now she's just 2 years old, but she actually covers a variety of ages from infancy all the way through adulthood. Welcome to the show, Developmental Psychology. Ethan, please tell us a bit about the history of developmental psychology.
So to describe this, one first has to understand really the fundamental concept of the developmental period, or essentially the notion that different points or periods in the lifespan have different characteristics. And we didn't always think this. There was a period of time where children, who were kind of the primary focus of attention among developmental psychologists, children were not viewed as any different than adults. Certainly they were smaller and perhaps cuter, and perhaps their head was much larger in proportion to their body, but they were really just considered miniature adults, which is why people didn't think twice about, for example, having children work in dangerous working conditions. Again, they were just small adults. However, in Western thinking, the idea of developmental periods, again, the idea that different periods in the lifespan have different characteristics, began to be addressed in several famous works by, for example, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which in these writings, they essentially stated that children were different than adults in some particular way. Now, although they differed in the particulars, a number of well-known individuals read these works and decided to study these differences, including Charles Darwin, Alfred Binet, who created the standardized test, so you can thank him for that, Jean Piaget, and so on. Thus was the birth of developmental psychology, and again, initially, researchers and others in developmental psychology focused on childhood because there's so much development that occurs during that period of time. But more contemporary developmental psychology is going to focus on all points in the lifespan.
Okay, and what exactly do developmental psychologists do?
Oh, a really simple answer to that. So developmental psychologists study how humans change psychologically, physically, socio-emotionally, cognitively throughout the lifespan. So from conception to death, cradle to the grave, womb to the tomb.
And last but not least, if this field has caught someone's eye, what should she or he do to pursue a professional career in developmental psychology?
You can do a number of different things. Of course, obtain a PhD studying human development, and work at a university or work as a clinical psychologist. But since human development is a pretty central concern of many different professions, your options are pretty open. So, for example, many medical professionals, pediatric doctors, for example, and educators focus on particular periods of development. But, of course, their academic training and their occupational preparation would differ pretty markedly from your standard developmental psychologist. So it really just kind of depends on where you want to apply that knowledge of developmental psychology, and that really determines what your academic and career path might be.
Okay. Our next field that I'd like to welcome is social psychology. So, truth be told, social psychology didn't actually want to come to this speed dating session at all. But I told her that everybody else was going, and so she changed her mind. Ethan, not good.
Yeah, that was great. Keep it going, man. You're batting 1,000 here.
No. Ethan, please tell us a little about the history of social psychology.
Okay. So social psychology is really based on a pretty basic idea, and that idea is that society influences people, and people in turn influence society. Now, this is a really old idea that permeates classic texts in both the East and the West. But social psychology, in its more contemporary form as we know it, really didn't emerge until the early 20th century. Oddly enough, in the work of a sports psychologist who was studying social facilitation in cyclists, so how cycling performance could be improved or not by the presence of others. But then the field really grew quickly as a result of government investment, particularly during World War II, when we were interested in things like persuasion and obedience and how to create effective propaganda, for example. And then later in the 20th century, we were more interested in social problems such as prejudice and discrimination and the like. And social psychology can speak to these things. So much of this research into these topics generated provocative findings, and interest among both academic and lay populations, and often the results were of practical import. So as a result, the field grew from there.
And what exactly do social psychologists do?
Well, they study how individuals' thoughts, emotions, and behaviors influence and are influenced by other people and the social environment. You know, given that humans are social creatures, we're social animals, we live within a social context. A key assumption of social psychology is that all behavior is in some way impacted to some degree by other people. And so they study that.
Okay, and last but not least, what should someone do to pursue a career in social psychology?
Okay. So like before, the precise type of training that you need depends on the type of career that you're pursuing. Most individuals will obtain a bachelor's degree in general psych or perhaps a related field like sociology, and then pursue a PhD in social psychology. And unlike evolutionary psych, where there's or positive psych, where there are a few graduate programs dedicated to those particular fields, there are many different graduate programs dedicated specifically to social psychology. Doctoral level social psychologists often work in universities, teaching and doing research, having positions as professors, research scientists, and so on. But notably, many social psychologists are also employed in the private sector because, again, many of the findings can be applied so readily to the real world. And the education for these positions, both in terms of the type of education, for example, your major, and the degree you need, is as varied as the different careers one could potentially pursue. So, for example, many social psychologists work as consultants, non-academic researchers, managers, marketing directors, human resource specialists, and in other positions. And given the variety, there's a number of different areas you can focus your education.
All right. So our final field of psychology is forensic psychology. Now, by the time that I asked forensic psychology to come on the show today, I think the fields had been talking about how bad my sense of humor was, and so she didn't want to come either. So I tricked her into coming, actually. I told her that we needed help solving a murder.
Yeah.
Anyway, she's here now, but she says
Did she scream out, "I don't do that"?
That's exactly. She says that she's only here to make sure that I don't completely misrepresent what forensic psychologists actually do.
Oh, good. Okay.
So, Ethan, if forensic psychologists, if they're not constantly hot on the heels of violent criminals, then what do they really do?
So forensic psychology is perhaps one of the most misunderstood areas of psychology. Forensic psychologists apply psychological knowledge and principles in the legal domain. That's what they do. They can do this in a number of different ways, but typically this is in a fashion that is much less dramatic than what one might see on TV in various shows that include forensic psychologists. The forensic psychologists may perform assessments of those involved in the legal system, so they might be doing competency evaluations for individuals about to stand trial. They might be doing child custody evaluations. They might be doing threat assessment evaluations, but just doing basic assessments. They may serve as expert witnesses, and they may be involved in mediation and dispute resolution. They oftentimes provide consultation and assist with jury selection and so on. But this is all pretty mundane stuff. They're not criminal profilers. They're not responsible for solving crimes or murders, and they don't interrogate subjects. They're just psychologists that work in the legal system.
Okay, so I've been watching Mindhunter, but maybe you could give me a clearer picture of the history of forensic psych.
I probably can, although I haven't seen Mindhunter, so I don't know how accurate that particular show might be, but I will say that this is a relatively young subdiscipline in psychology. The field has grown substantially in the last 30 years or so. Currently, the field has its own professional organizations. It has dedicated training programs. It has specialized research journals, and it is expected that the field is going to experience marked continued growth due to the increased application of psychological knowledge to legal matters, and the need for well-trained psychologists to assist with these matters, to essentially work within the legal system to assist in having it function better. Now, additionally, the growth is spurred on by those TV shows that many forensic psychologists probably loathe because the provocative subject matter and perhaps that exaggerated depiction of forensic psychology attracts individuals' interest, student interest, and in turn encourages folks to pursue a career in this area.
So forensic psychologists aren't constantly looking over their shoulder and seeing potential serial killers in everyone they see, including themselves?
Well, I'm not a forensic psychologist, so I can't speak directly to that. But my suspicion is that the vast majority are not doing that.
Maybe that show's not 100% right. Okay, so what should someone do to pursue a career in forensic psych?
So forensic psych is, for the most part, a postdoctoral specialization. Now, of course, you can study psych and law, forensic psych in your educational training at the undergraduate level or graduate level. But for the most part, it's a postdoctoral specialization. And this means that your run-of-the-mill forensic psychologist will have earned an undergraduate and graduate degree in psychology prior to receiving any specialized training in forensic psychology. And note that given the emphasis on psychological assessment that I talked about earlier, as well as development and implementation of treatment programs and so on, forensic psychologists often have clinical training, so they're actual clinical psychologists holding PhDs or PsyDs in either clinical or counseling psychology. But then they tend to have several years postdoctoral experience engaged in forensics relevant activities. Now, the type of skills that one develops beyond that really, again, depends on what area of forensic psychology or what the nature of your work is. But generally speaking, for any forensic psychologist, it's critical that they have extensive legal knowledge, because nearly all of the activities that a forensic psychologist engages in require a firm understanding of the various policies, procedures, and requirements common to legal proceedings and domains.
Well, Ethan, I can't thank you enough for chatting with us today and putting up with my antics. I think someone out there might call it humor, and for sharing some of your knowledge about these 6 popular fields in psych.
No, I was happy to speak with you, Bradley, and I found you to be hilarious. I don't know what you're so concerned about, but I wanted to thank you for entertaining me for the last half hour and encourage you to pursue a career in perhaps stand-up comedy.
I don't know about it. And listeners, if you liked my humor, leave a review. I'd love to read that. Well, this has been fun. We need to do this again sometime.
I would be happy to come back and be interviewed. And I will hope that your material will change, because I want to hear some fresh jokes.
Okay, well, we'll see what I can do. This season right now is filled up, but maybe we make this like a yearly thing where we come back and do another speed dating with Fields of Psychology.
Let's do it. I'd look forward to it.
So, you just listened to another episode of the Psych Everywhere podcast. Like what you heard, please feel free to share this episode with your students and colleagues. Also, remember to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcast. Last but not least, if you'd like to learn more about the Fields of Psychology, be sure to check out Ethan's Contemporary Psychology magazine column in Ion Psychi magazine. In each issue of the magazine, Ethan features a different field of psychology and includes valuable information about popular resources and how to get involved. To find a full list of these articles, visit www.psychi.org/publications_search, and then from here just simply type in his last name in the search authors category. Okay everyone, that's all for now. I'll talk to you again soon. Oh, there's my bell. Copyright 2020. Psi Chi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. All rights reserved.